Hello, my name is Allison Malloy, and for my war photography presentation, I chose the photo better known as Saigon Execution by the American photographer Eddie Adams, who was a staff photographer and photojournalist with the Associated Press. In this photo, we see General Nguyen Loc Loen, the South Vietnamese chief of police, shooting captain of the Viet Cong, Nguyen Van Lem. This photo was shot during the Vietnam War. This war was the direct result of the First Indochina War between France and the North Vietnamese government, and the Viet Cong fought to reunify Vietnam during this war. It was viewed as a colonial war and a continuation of this first war in Vietnam. However, the U.S. later joined in the efforts to reunify Vietnam. Leading up to Saigon Execution, which was photographed on February 1st, 1968, in the Chinese quarter of the capital of Vietnam, Saigon, the man being shot, who was Viet Cong officer Nguyen Van Lem, was the captain of a Viet Cong revenge squad that earlier in that day executed South Vietnamese officers and unarmed civilians, many of whom included families of officers of South Vietnamese origin. Lem was a prisoner of war and captured at a mass grave site that included 34 civilian bodies, including members of officers' families. Photographer Eddie Adams was a former photographer and also a military man himself, many of whom had fought in the Korean War prior to the Vietnam War. He was, as I said earlier, a staff photographer with the Associated Press based in Vietnam at the time, and he happened to be in Saigon where he was on duty, ordered to take photos of anything that resembled action, and got wind of a small battle that had occurred earlier that day between the South Vietnamese and Viet Cong. Other journalists happened to be there at the time, and when he saw Captain Nguyen Van Lem being let out of a building, I have a recording of his response to that situation, and he reacted as any photographer would in the situation during wartime.
We seen them pulling this guy out of a building, and they were like taking him by the hand, and they pulled him out on the street. Any photographer, say news photographer, we seen them pulling this guy out of a building, and they were like taking him by the hand, and they pulled him out on the street. Any photographer, say news photographer, when you grab a prisoner, you just follow him. I mean, it's a picture. You know, you follow him until he's loaded to a wagon and driven away. That's exactly what we did. We seen him grab this guy, and we started walking him down the street, and had a sequence of pictures, just walking. I don't know who this guy is. But they stopped for a minute. I was about 5 feet away from the prisoner. To my left came this guy. I had no idea. I had a 35 millimeter lens and a single frame camera, and he went over, and I seen him go for his pistol. Well, when somebody goes for their pistol, they normally threaten. But I've taken pictures like that, somebody threatening somebody, you know, do this or I'm going to shoot you, and nothing ever happened. So I seen him go for his pistol. As soon as he raised his pistol, I took one frame. And right after this happened, this guy comes walking, he puts his pistol in his holster, and came walking right by, and he said they killed many of my men and many of your people, and just kept walking. And that's all he said. I think 2 people's lives were destroyed that day. General's life was destroyed as well. And I don't want to destroy anybody's life. That's not my job, you know. I mean, it really isn't.
So here we see Adams reflecting on the experience. In terms of the composition of the photo, I chose 3 elements and principles to focus on: emphasis and focal point, value, and space, or the use of depth of field in the decisive moment image we see here. Regarding emphasis and focal point, we see the uniformed police officer to the left, General Loen, standing with his back to us, the viewer, the photographer, with his right arm fully extended, his left arm completely loose by his side, and the prisoner to the right, with his arms supposedly cuffed behind his back, wearing no uniform and civilian clothing. The general's arm is extended to the right with directing our eye across the picture plane as we move towards that focal point of the prisoner. He's more centered on the picture plane. Though in his 30s, Lem, the man featured here to the right, looks a little older than a boy, and his face is contorted from the bullet's impact. This shows the moment the bullet entered the captain's head, the moment of death. Regarding value or the tonal range within the image, we see much happening even though it was spur of the moment. Because of the point of view that Adams took when shooting this image, highlights on the general's face, upper shoulders, and loose left arm, and shadows on his lower back, uniform, and dark hair distinguish him from the background space. The highlight on his pistol calls attention to the act occurring, separating the shiny metallic gun from the gray tones around it. The strong highlight on the Viet Cong prisoner's wincing eyes, which we see here, and shadows upon the lower portion of his face featuring a contorted mouth, calls viewers' attention to the violence taking place in the moment and the pain felt. The highlight upon the soldier's face behind the general and the brighter uniformed soldier on the right side separates both of those figures from the gray background, which also helps frame the two central figures. Regarding space and depth of field, the general and Viet Cong prisoner appear in the foreground of the image, close to the viewer and the photographer as the main point of emphasis, their figures significantly cropped at the bottom of the picture plane, whereas two of the less in focus South Vietnamese uniformed soldiers appear in the middle ground, just behind the general and prisoner, as we see more of their bodies than the overlapping with the general's figure. Lastly, the background is de-emphasized in more of a middle grain tonal range. This depth of field that Adams chose to use seems to appear about a middle f-stop with a shallow depth of field occurring, de-emphasizing the background and emphasizing the figures in the foreground, which are much more sharply in focus than the background city space. The intended interpretation and emotional response of this image was unlike anything that Adams could have predicted. It was an unanticipated image that was a close-up portrait that ultimately resulted in storytelling beyond even the image. It was very much a one-sided story being told without much of what preceded the photo revealed in the initial publication. Saigon Execution, as the photo quickly became referred to, was quickly reproduced around the world. It was held up at demonstrations across the United States and really became a symbol of the anti-war movement and an iconic symbol of the Vietnam War. Films of the exact same execution did not have the visual impact of Adams' still photo. As cited by Hal Buell, who ran the Associated Press for 23 years, you can see the gun, you can see the expressions on the man's face as the bullet enters his head, and you see the soldier on the left who is wincing at the thing that has happened. With the still picture, you have time to consider all of these factors, which you did not get in the moving image. On the right, we see some protesters referring to that horrendous incident in Saigon with that Saigon puppet poster. The intended audience were readers initially of the New York Times in the United States, which also in the same spread featured an image of a child killed by the Viet Cong in an attempt by the newspaper to achieve some sort of balance in reporting. The scene was also, as I mentioned earlier, recorded by an NBC TV cameraman from the United States, but the footage did not get the same impact as that still image. Adams never considered himself a patriot in any way that would offend anyone or hurt anyone. And he really never came to terms with the fact that the anti-war movement saw his photo as proof that the Vietnam War was unjustified. He was a former U.S. military man, and he believed that the photo really only ended telling a portion of the truth. Many people died during the war, and it is a one-sided image based on the caption included and how it was disseminated across the country. I did choose to include a contact sheet here of several images that show the sequence of events leading up to the captain's execution. The one photo that was selected ultimately for publication and then others released later, is featured here towards the center of his roll of film. I find it probably the most compositionally satisfying, and really it was the decisive moment that made this photo what it was and as iconic as it was. Two more photos, just slightly larger views from that same contact sheet, so that you can see a little bit more of the number of people that were around, and just some of the events that and reactions that led up to and followed that shooting. Why this photo became well known? Well, it was initially published by the New York Times, which had a huge readership. Even though the Tet Offensive continued after the photo was taken and disseminated, this photo really displayed this idea that the Vietnam War was headed in a wrong direction, and it was used as kind of a propagandistic way of doing it, a way to convince Americans that the war was unwinnable and seemingly unjustified. It was decontextualized within the presentation of the ultimate image. The moment was frozen in time. The split second that this event happened shows the pain, the anguish of war. And according to a researcher at Loyola, the photo did translate to the news in a way that was visual and you could not quantify in a way that this had the most impact. In terms of making a powerful image, it was a very immediate photo, decisive moment, a very intimate photo, a portrait of a man dying, and really became a symbol of Vietnam's war brutality and the horrors of war. It was shocking visual evidence for the American people who were questioning and starting to question the government at the time regarding was Vietnam worth it. And they started to question their own government, and the anti-war movement and protest built based on this image. It instantly became an icon of the war's savagery, and the general was never really able to recover from this. Even after his immigration to the United States, he was always perceived as a villain. And according to Adams, in his own words, he really thought of it just as an image of war, one man killing another man, and that's what war is about, good guys and bad guys. He did not anticipate that this would lead to being such a pivotal image. And in the end, this photo, Saigon Execution, is an icon of the Vietnam War. It will forever be tied as a symbol of the Vietnam War within our iconographic history. It was voted by Time magazine editors and people involved within the magazine as one of the most 100 most influential photos ever taken. And Adams will reiterate that this photo and any sort of still photo is a very powerful weapon in itself, even though it is just a print on a piece of paper or a digital image, pixels going out in the universe. We now see war as a very different animal, and it is much more intimate in terms of photography that photojournalists are able to capture, really ultimately as a result of this photo, which did win the Pulitzer Prize in 1969. And he kind of regrets that award and recognition as well, because he sees this photo as the photo that ruined the general's life and ultimately his legacy, perceived as a villain. And even though he tries to and lives by perceiving this man who is now gone, as is Adams, as a hero. I also have included my reference list here. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you so much for viewing my presentation.